Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to introduce our moderator for tonight's panel. And our moderator is the incredible Rosalind Helfand, who has directed Sci-Fest L.A. short sci-fi writing competitions, the Tomorrow Prize, as I mentioned, and the Roswell Awards for over 5 years. She's also organized and curated many of Southern California's major literary events, including the West Hollywood Book Fair, LitFest Pasadena, and Lit Crawl LA. And she's the managing editor, former managing editor of the literary journal Literature for Life. Rosalind was inspired by her passion for sci-fi to think about solving the world's problems and is currently working with a global team on solutions for tackling climate change and biodiversity collapse. And without further ado, welcome Rosalind.
Thank you so much, Corey. And I also want to acknowledge that Corey has been a fellow literary organizer with me in Los Angeles for many years and the co-director of the West Hollywood Book Fair with me. And it's been an honor and a privilege to work with him now on the science fiction writing competitions. So everybody, I'm thrilled to be your moderator tonight. We have such an incredible panel. We will be posting, actually Corey will be posting the full biographies of our panelists, but I'm going to introduce them in just a moment and tell you a little bit about them to get started before we launch into our discussion about writing great sci-fi. And as Corey was telling you, we're here tonight to not just have a great conversation, but raise awareness about our science fiction writing competitions in a time when arts funding is running low, and we hope that you'll consider making a donation to keep us going, and Corey will be posting that link in the chat box. If you have a question, we would love for you to share it with us. You can use the Q&A function to do that, and we will go into Q&A at the end of our panel and take around 15 to 20 minutes to answer some of your questions and continue our discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panel. So let's bring them on. So first with us is Steven Barnes. He's a New York Times best-selling author, screenwriter, and educator who has written more than 30 sci-fi, fantasy, and horror novels. Next is CECIL Castellucci. CECIL is the award-winning and New York Times best-selling author of books and graphic novels for young adults, including Shade, The Changing Girl, Boy Proof, The Plain Jane, Soupy Leaves Home, The Year of the Beast, Tin Star, Female Furies, and Odd Duck. In 2015, she co-authored Star Wars Moving Target, a Princess Leia adventure. Then we have TANANARIVE Du. She is an award-winning author who teaches Black horror and Afrofuturism at UCLA. She's an executive producer on Shudder's groundbreaking documentary horror Noir, A History of Black Horror. And she and her husband and collaborator, Steven Barnes, who's with us today, wrote A Small Town for season 2 of The Twilight Zone on CBS All Access. Henry LIEN is a 2012 graduate of Clarion West Writers Workshop in Seattle. He is the author of the critically acclaimed and award-winning Peasprout Chen middle grade fantasy series, which he began writing under the guidance of George R.R. Martin, Kelly Link, and Chuck Palahniuk at Clarion West. His sci-fi short fiction has appeared in publications like Asimov's Analog. And last but certainly not least, we have Larry Niven, who is the Hugo and Nebula award-winning author of such iconic classics as Ringworld, The Integral Trees, and Destiny's Road. And he has collaborated with both Jerry Pournelle and Steven Barnes on the legacy of Harrowrot, Beowulf's Children, and the Dream Park series. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And I'm going to go ahead and throw out a first question, and I'd love for you, whoever wants to dive in first, go for it. But let's have fun with this one. What's a sci-fi story or book, other than one of your own, to which you had a strong emotional response? And I want to emphasize in a good way. And why? What invoked that response? Go for it.
I've always had strong responses to Arthur Clarke's stories. His characters are a little shallow, but his stories are deep, gripping. His view of the universe is huge, expansive.
What
Arthur Clarke.
Larry, what techniques do you think Arthur Clarke was using to evoke that response from you?
I think he had a better imagination than everybody else, and also did his research for fun the way I do.
Nice.
Research for fun, hope it generates stories. It generally will.
Thank you.
I would say that the first science fiction novel that I remember being really impressed by in very young was Half Spacesuit Will Travel, Robert Heinlein. And yeah, that would be true. That would probably be the one that opened my eyes, because before there'd been a couple of novels, but they were really for kids, Space Cat and things of that nature.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I was trying to think about this question, and I really wanted to sort of dig into what sort of captured my imagination when I was young, when I first wanted to, be in there. And I think for like space, like being in space, it was Heinlein's Citizen of the Galaxy was probably for me a big book. But then I also, there was a sort of alien invasion story trilogy called the Tripod Trilogy by John Christopher that I just loved. And I think both of those books, by men, are, they were about kids who were sort of taking care of, the spaceship or the alien invasion. And so that's what really attracted to me was that I felt like I could put myself into the story. Of course, I just made the boys be girls.
Well, this is going to sound like maybe a strange answer. I had picked this answer before you said uplifting, but it is uplifting to me, even though it's post-apocalyptic and a very difficult story, is Octavia E. Butler's Parable of the Sower. And the reason I'll mention it as uplifting is, as dreary as that world is, and as violent as it is, and as difficult as it is, she's really embedded a lot of hope with this religion of Earthseed. And especially now, I find that very, very inspirational, because we're, going through so much as a society, that those little kernels of hope are so important.
Awesome. Henry.
I struggled with this question because I'm a loquacious person. I'm trying to keep it short so I'm not dominating the airtime. I would say if I had to have a short answer, it'd be anything by Ted Chiang. Ted Chiang is my absolute favorite writer. He's the only writer I can think of who has never written anything that wasn't truly worth reading. I mean, everything that he puts out is absolutely worth reading. But I would say that the book that rocked my world the hardest and the earliest was The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. And I'm still learning why that book was so influential for me. If you don't know about it, it's also an Amazon Prime series right now, and it's about an alternate history in which the U.S. lost World War II. But everybody in that world is reading a book about a world where America won the World War II. So it's got this interesting structure. But the thing that I'm learning about now is that Philip K. Dick insists that he did not write The Man in the High Castle, because he discovered something called the I Ching when he started writing it. And the I Ching is a book of poetry from Chinese history, but it's also an oracle. And it freaked him out, it spooked him, but he surrendered all of the plot decisions in the writing of this book to the I Ching, so that whenever he encountered an important critical plot juncture, he would say, I Ching, what happens next? And the I Ching directed the course of the plot. And so, I mean, looking at Western storytelling, which is very much about the individual and very much about identity, the identity of the author and the identity of the readers, here is a book that surrenders identity and says, I did not write this, some cosmic force wrote this. That blows my mind. So this is a book that is perpetually interesting, that I will probably return to as long as I'm alive. So I would say my long answer is The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick.
Fantastic. Does anyone want to elaborate on some of the techniques that you think writers use to get these really strong emotional responses in their readers?
I think that the most important thing a writer can do is to try to make sure that their perspective, their view, the thing that they're feeling, the initial creative or emotional impulse is conveyed as sharply and as strongly as possible. Then those who are on their wavelength will get it. And if you're not on their wavelength, you won't. I mean, chase after what the reader, what you think the reader wants. You speak your truth and then trust that if you go deeply enough into the specific, you emerge in the universal.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I also think that when you're writing for young people, it's that high concept that they're encountering for the first time about something that's like super cool and outside of their what? Like I volunteered in elementary school, and I remember this little girl was talking about, you know, outer space, and I was like, well, you know, we're in outer space, and it blew her mind that we were like living on a planet, you know. And I think it's that kind of thing that when we're writing science fiction for young people, that that sort of introduction to these sort of bigger sort of ideas about science and, you know, math and, you know, all of those kinds of things that play into it.
I'd like to piggyback on what Steve said about leaning into things that are personal. I think that that is a really important aspect of coming up with unique, memorable ideas for science fiction that other people haven't written, because you have to balance the personal and the political and the interplanetary. And one of the ways that you do that is that you do make it personal. So to go back to my favorite example of The Man in the High Castle and Philip K. Dick, you know, Philip K. Dick suffered from mental illness, and he was very, very open about that in a time when it was hard to be open about having mental illness. And he suffered greatly his whole life. But one of the things that he understood was that mental illness is hard because it shatters your faith in reality, the shared reality that you have with other people. So it's incredibly isolating. But he absolutely embraced that. And his stories, his books are all about shattering reality. And we're still just catching up with his ideas now. I mean, Ursula Le Guin called him the American Jorge Luis Borges, and I think that that's really very apt. He didn't run from his mental illness. He said, these are stories that only somebody with my conditions, my mental illness, could write. And so he embraced what made him him, even the worst parts. And I find that incredibly moving and noble, that he created beauty out of the worst parts of himself.
Great. So you actually, Henry, you kind of tapped into what my next question was about, which was making stories memorable. And I'd love, let's go over to Larry for this one. Larry, drawing on your own works, some of your own a novel or stories that you've written, what's something that you have done, or a story that you would use as an example where you have really sought to make it memorable and you felt that you effectively achieved that with your readers?
I and Jerry Pournelle together wrote a sequel to Dante's Inferno. Getting the emotions of a guy under extreme stress is about as much as I've done to that. But look at A Mote in God's Eye and Horace Berry crossing between two spaceships with a spacesuit behind him that's actually full of Modi brownies. That's when I got into this field, the younger writers around me were all concentrated on big inflated ideas. They had forgotten that a reader can get behind a situation when his main character is in danger of his life. Just saving his own life is enough.
Fantastic. TANANARIVE, I'd love to throw it over to you.
In terms of what I've done to try to be memorable?
And where you think you've really succeeded with that?
I think you try with every book, but some are more memorable than others. And I think one of my reader favorites is my second novel, which is called My Soul to Keep. And it's about an immortal who marries a woman who's mortal and doesn't realize she's immortal. And I didn't realize I was writing such a memorable book, but I think the reason people really respond to it is it's a tragic love story. And I think so many of us can relate to that. But also these questions of what it means to be mortal, especially in terms of experiencing loss, and how different it is when loss doesn't touch you the same way. It's just sort of really a reflection, but you have so many losses that you have to shut off the part of your brain that even feels the pain. And I think a lot of us can relate to that in 2020, frankly. I mean, I don't know, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I just heard that the actor Chadwick Boseman has passed away at a very young age from colon cancer. And it's like, you know, one thing after another thing after another thing. And I think with an immortal who's lived for 500 years and has suffered the loss of many, many children, many, many wives, is just something that my readers really respond to.
Fantastic. Thanks. Steven, you want to, oh, sorry, do you want to jump in on that?
Look, every human being has their own unique way of looking at the world. I mean, I believe that art has the same core questions that philosophy has. Who am I and what is true? And those are the only two real questions to ask. And I think any work of art is exploring either the identity of what it means to be human in the general or in the specific, in personal, or what is the, you know, the ethical structure of the universe. What is it that human beings are perceiving in the world around them? One way or the other, you know, stories do that. Even if you believe that the universe is random or controlled by, you know, by forces beyond any conceivable ken, that's one thing. If you believe that the universe responds to the way human beings interact with it and you know, respects our wills and efforts, then that's something too. And every human being is going to have a different view on what that means. And I think that you try to write stories that represent, what do you think human beings are? What do you think the universe is? And if you do that honestly and powerfully, you will have a balance that no other human being quite has. There isn't anybody quite like you. And so all you have to do is to speak your truth in that sense. And so like I said, it's finding the right words, the right phrases, the right images, the right combinations of different techniques in order to create something that gives the reader the feeling that they've been sitting down and speaking to you, you know, personally, that you've had an opportunity to turn yourself inside out and to convey, this is the way the world looks, this is what I think people are, this is what I have felt, this is what I've experienced. Do that, and you have the chance to create a memorable experience.
Fantastic. CECIL, I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a hard thing because I think what is memorable to a reader is completely different for each reader, you know, because we never know how our works or our worlds are going to land onto other people. And so it is our mission in a way to, you know, just sort of stay true to our voices and write the, you know, story. So I completely echo what Steven is saying. I think everyone's saying. I would say that one thing that I like to do is I like to give myself a little challenge with each book that I write, you know, like what can I do that's a little bit different? Can I do this or that? And so when I was writing my duology, Tin Star, I really wanted to make a science fiction book about a galactic sort of empire where humans were not the main, you know, that they were kind of like this new species that nobody cared about at all. And, you know, we're like sort of, you know, very unimportant because a lot of science fiction, not all of it, but, you know, but especially for YA is very sort of human centric. And I wanted to do something that wasn't human centric. And what would that be like to, so it's about a girl who's abandoned on an alien space station. And she's the only one there, and she has to mimic the aliens in order to survive. And so I wanted it to be a more soft thing rather than, you know, sort of like, oh, we're humans and we're here. And so with each book, I think for me, it's more what is memorable for me, what I tried to accomplish in that narrative.
Fantastic. Henry, you want to jump in? Oh, sorry, Larry, go for it.
When I worked with Jerry Pournelle, I came to realize I was the crazy one. Your madness is important, just as just as we've been saying. Your madness is the only thing that separates you from the rest of the writers. Yeah.
Go for it, Henry.
I'm going to echo what Larry said. The idea of flying your freak flag high and proud, but with a very specific treatment. And that is to take a couple of things that you are looking at that you're interested in and don't decide between them. Mash them together into one story and see if you can find connections between them. And I think that what that exercise does for writers is part of the value that writers create is not just creating things out of thin air, but also looking for connections among things in the world around us that nobody else has seen before. So looking for harmonic resonances or familial resemblances between different phenomena. That's part of the contribution of a writer as well. And I mean, from my own current series, my current series is about a boarding school where they teach a fictitious sport that combines figure skating with kung fu. And that was because I was interested in figure skating and kung fu at that time. And I just mashed them together for my own reading pleasure into one convenient place. But I realized in doing that, if I didn't want to do something that was just wacky, because I'm not into wacky, what is the natural connection? And if you close your eyes, there actually is a family resemblance between these two sports. They combine grace with athleticism. They are both art and sport at the same time. And then suddenly there was an entry into something that I had not seen before. So I really encourage people to ask themselves, what are you interested in? What is the weird thing that you think should go together and that nobody else has thought of? Mash them together. Look for connections, research, and see if there are connections. You might find that there are connections that nobody else has seen before.
All right, so I want to take this to something a little bit fun, which is plot twists. So everyone think for a second, what is a favorite plot twist that you've used? Something that you yourself were like, this is a good plot twist that I put together.
Are you making us, you're making us spoil our stories then?
Or, you know, it can be, well, hopefully everyone's read them already.
Sure.
I'm gonna not spoil my own plot twist, but I'm gonna say, like, I love in the film Planet of the Apes when, you know, you see the Statue of Liberty at the end and you realize that, you know, I love that kind of plot twist where suddenly everything that you think you knew completely solid, like, I am golden, I finally figured out this whole world, I know everything, or zoop is like, you know, the rug is taken out from under you and you have to reconsider all of your presumptions that you had about the world.
I'll mention Ringworld. Hello, you're on. Why am I not? There we are.
You're here.
In Ringworld, the main characters have traveled 1/4 across the width of the ring, a tiny distance, but it turns out that they've left their exit point behind them in Fist of God Mountain, a meteor that had plunged upward through the floor of the Ringworld from underneath. That's my favorite plot twist.
Nice. TANANARIVE, I noticed you wanted to share your plot twist. Go for it.
I'm trying to run through my books and I'm thinking I don't really rely a lot on plot twists in my speculative fiction, but Steve and I wrote a mystery series together called Tennyson Hardwick. And one of the books in that series was called In the Night of the Heat, where a character was murdered, like an O.J. Simpson style character was murdered. And it turned out that the murderer was his mother. Spoiler.
You got it here, folks, the spoilers. All right.
I'm not going to spoil any plot twists in my books because my books are very dependent on plot twists. And but I am going to tell you about a plot twist that inspired me to start writing. And that is Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. If anybody has, well, I can actually talk about it without spoiling it. I was not a reader as a kid. I didn't have good creators to lead me to the books that I would like. And so I discovered children's literature, children's fantasy and science fiction as an adult. And when I read the third Harry Potter book, Prisoner of Azkaban, I was blown away by the main twist of Hermione's very busy academic schedule. Let's just refer to it as that. And I didn't know how she achieved that. So I actually sat down and I plotted the book chapter for chapter, and I color coded every plot thread that was happening and tracked them. And I realized that the way that J.K. Rowling covered her tracks was everything was doing not just single duty, not double duty, not triple duty, not quadruple duty. It were doing 5 things at once. So Hermione, that thread of Hermione being really, really busy with her academic schedule. At first you think, oh, this is a running joke about how ambitious she is academically. And then there's another plot that's happening. You think, okay, well, this has to do with that plot, that mystery plot. And then Hermione and Ron and Harry start to have arguments and you realize, oh, no, this is just showing how Hermione is maturing more like girls at this age will mature. And then there's another plot happening with Professor Lupin and you realize, oh, no. She's actually researching what is wrong with Professor Lupin. By the time you find out the real reason Hermione's academic schedule is so busy, you realize that all 4 of those were valid plot threads. They were all decoys for the real reason why she was so busy. And at that point, you're just in free fall as a reader. And you're just left in awe of the choreography required to pull off 4 simultaneous tracks that all work individually, but were all decoys for the real plot twist. And I was inspired to write after I charted out Prisoner of Azkaban. So yeah, I'm a big fan of plot twists. I think that they create a feeling of genuine delight in a reader when they are done well and they are earned. So I'm a huge fan of plot twists, which is why I'm not going to spoil my own.
Okay, fair enough. I really didn't know that this would be such a loaded question when I came up with it, so totally get it. But Steven, do you want to add something to that?
No, I don't. I'm not kind of like T and TANANARIVE in the sense that I don't really think about plot twists per se. I do think about what do I believe would happen in a particular situation. If I was to think about a plot twist in a film that I really, really liked, I could certainly point to something like The Sixth Sense or The Usual Suspects. But I can remember playing dirty with one plot element in one of my first novels, where there is a scene where some people need to escape from a situation which they're being watched by an entire crowd. And I thought about it. There was really no way to do it. And then I realized that I didn't have to really do it. I didn't have to show them getting away. All I had to do was convince the reader that it was to distract the reader, and the reader would associate people in the stands who are watching the event. And if I could fool the reader, that they would believe I'd also fooled the people in the stands. They wouldn't think it through that much if the action was propulsive. So I had something happen in the stands where all of the readers' attention would go to that. And then when people went back to thinking about what was happening on the arena floor, the characters were gone. And nobody called me on it. I actually got away with that. Now that's not exactly what you're talking about, but that was an instance of manipulating plot. I mean, the plot is basically the way, it reveals, characterization reveals what you think about people, plot reveals what you think about the universe, because it's basically the way the universe responds to what human beings try to do when confronted with it. So if you believe that the universe has an ethical structure, if you believe the universe has a random structure, if you believe the universe is benign or malign, or whatever it is, it's going to come out in that relationship. So the way you play with plot is part of the way you explore your sense of reality.
Fantastic, thank you. So I know we've touched a little bit on this idea of big ideas, but also, as Larry Niven pointed out, sometimes going simple can be just as powerful as a big idea. But how do you seek to make big ideas or big issues like social injustice, for example, relatable in your stories, in your work?
I tend to remember that I don't know what's going on very much. I'm not a good politician. I don't understand human nature very, very well. And I try to keep my tendrils from reaching too far out in that direction. I do understand astrophysics, and that's where the fun comes in. And also anthropology. These can be fun. Let me say this while I've got the stage. Lucifer's Hammer is a very simple idea, and it's one of my most successful novels. Our most successful novels. I wrote it with Jerry Pournelle. The idea is a comet nucleus is going to hit the Earth. And that's just as simple as it gets, except for all of the ramifications. You want to write great fiction, a simple idea is your best bet.
Fantastic, thank you. Who else would like to go with that? Making these ideas relatable.
Well, I just finished a novel called The Reformatory, which is basically a ghost story set at a haunted reformatory. And it's a fairly simple, relatable story about a child who gets locked up here and has to try to plot his way out. But it's really about a bigger question, which is mass incarceration, which is juvenile justice. And I wanted to write that about that subject from the beginning, but had I started in a more sprawling way, I think it would have been more difficult. They say 1,000 people is a statistic and one person is a tragedy if they die. So I really do try to go down the line of the personal when I'm talking about big issues. And I do tend to write child narrators because who's more empathetic than a child who's going through a hard time and has to think and be brave and get out of it.
Yeah, when I wrote Shade the Changing Girl, which is a DC comic, it's an alien who possesses the body of I rebooted it as a 16-year-old girl. I wanted to sort of equate the idea of a teenager who doesn't really have any voice in sort of society. They can't vote, they can't even drive sometimes. And also the changes that the teenage body is going through, sort of with this alien who now has to behave like a human being. And I think one of the things that's the advantage of a teen protagonist is that, I mean, unless you're a preteen, we've all been through adolescence, and so we've all been through the change of going from child to adult, and where a pimple on your nose is literally the end of the world. Like it is the end of the world, and also you have like things erupting from you. And so I think it goes back to I think what we all were kind of saying is that it's the person, the microscopic sort of makes it able to be bigger.
Fantastic.
I think that everything that everybody has said the most important things about how to make things relatable, and that is to write with heart. I think that there are also additional things that you can do with craft that can help make things relatable. And for example, I wrote this one story called The Ladies Aquatic Gardening Society, which is all about awful people in the Gilded Age, rich people in the Gilded Age, and I was writing from the viewpoint of a horrible person. She's sexist and she's racist and she's classist, and because there was no other entry into this particular world, and I wanted to write about the Gilded Age. But structurally, there are things that you can do. So I set it up with the story is a novelette, but it's set up in chapters. And at the chapters, at the beginning of every chapter, I indicate who is going to prevail at these social duels, these verbal duels that occur in these great salons in Newport, Rhode Island. And the protagonist is declared to lose every one in every chapter after chapter. She's going to lose. And at some point, just structurally, you say, okay, well, I'm going to keep reading to find out, is she ever going to win? And so that was a narrative trick that Connie Willis, I worked on this story with Connie Willis at Clarion West, and that was something that she suggested. She said, if even the most despicable person, the most despicable protagonist who does not deserve your empathy, even that person will end up being somebody that people will at least slightly root for if you structurally set it up that way, so that there's a suspense of finding out, is she ever going to win? And that was an act of empathy for me, to try to understand a mindset that I very much disagreed with. And the only way that I could do that, there was no way that I could try to justify her racist and sexist and classist ideas, but structurally, this was a way to keep people from putting the story down. So I think that there are things from a craft standpoint that can help with that, in addition to the most important thing, which is to write from the heart.
Great. Steven, you want to jump in on that?
I was thinking just for a second that if heart is the initial artistic impulse, it's Henry was speaking of, as far as I'm concerned, is the head, is the language with which you communicate it, and that varies from art to art. That art is self-expression in that sense. Successful art being self-expression with communication, and every art form will have a language. You know, there's martial art where the language is, you know, is physical technique. There's dance, there's painting and sculpture, you know, and pottery and poetry and short stories and novels and songs. And each of these things is using a different language in order to communicate that emotional impulse. So without the intellect, without the head, you can have all the feeling in the world, but nobody will grasp what it is that you're saying. So it's critical to get your basic technique down at the level of unconscious competence. You know, that you go from conscious and unconscious incompetence, where you've never even seen a bicycle, to conscious competence, where you're aware that you can't ride a bicycle, to conscious incompetence, where you're aware that you can't ride one, to conscious competence, where you can ride one as long as you focus, and then unconscious competence, which is look ma no hands. That's the point that any art form has to get to before it can become art and not merely technique or merely science. The point where you dissolve the self and can simply enter into the form, which is one of the reasons I think why short stories are so important, because they're short enough to be a knowable world. You know, they're only a couple thousand words max, and therefore you can get your mind around the entire shape. And by the time you've done that a dozen times, you've got your basic skills at that unconscious competence level, and you're ready to go on to a longer form or a deeper form.
Tananarive, you teach Afrofuturism at UCLA.
Yeah.
And I'd love to know, just kind of riffing off of this question, first of all, just so that the audience really understands, if you could just tell us what Afrofuturism, how you define it, and then what are some of the big ideas that you really see coming out of that genre?
Okay. Different people have different definitions. The one I've sort of adapted for my teaching is the Black speculative arts, which is the films, literature, comics, music, even with Janelle Monáe, and a lot of the futurism in her music from the African diaspora. And part of that is also African futurism, which is a term that Nnedi Okorafor has coined to specifically talk about speculative fiction coming out of Africa. So the ideas differ, you know, according to the artists, but some of the overarching themes that unite these works are, yes, futurism, although that's somewhat deceptive, because the way I teach it, it could also be something like Get Out, which is horror and not futurism. It can be Daughters of the Dust, which is actually set in the past. But one aspect of Afrofuturism is to honor the past while looking ahead to the future. And I think a lot of these artists are basically trying to create visibility of Black characters, of Black yearning and ideas, because so much of that has been absent in the historical popular culture. Like the first 2 minutes of Lovecraft were like fantasy fulfillment of every huge movie that Black actors never got to be in the 1950s. And there's part of that, it's inserting yourself in the story. And I think the most important idea that comes out of Afrofuturism is survivability, because some of you may remember there were no Black characters in the original Star Trek. We had disappeared, and it wasn't done intentionally, but as a Black viewer, you feel erased. So we're always having to remind ourselves, no matter how hard things get, we were here and we will be here. And just those two things are huge ideas.
Thank you. Larry, you talked about having knowledge of anthropology as well. How have you brought that knowledge of anthropology into your work?
I had a wonderful idea, and a lot of my work is derived from it. The idea is that all of the symptoms you know of aging, particularly debilitating aging, are all aborted versions of something intended to make you stronger. The human race has 3 stages: childhood, breeder, and protector. We never get to protector because there was a virus that never reached Earth. When our ancestors arrived, and our ancestors were Homo habilis at the time. I might have to fiddle with that if it had to be done today, but it's the basic human being that evolved into human beings in one direction and into apes and chimpanzees and bonobos in several other directions. Your teeth, you lose your teeth because your gums are going to become a hard, bony beak. You lose your sexual orientations because you're going to be protecting your descendants. You grow a big nose because you're going to be smelling the whether your descendants are actually your descendants or somebody else's. Your joints expand. You give greater leverage to the muscles. That's arthritis if it doesn't go as far as the protective version. It was a wonderful idea, and I've used it ever since.
Have you, in your collaborations with Steven Barnes, you know, Steven, if you want to jump in there, when you're collaborating on your stories together, how are you bouncing off each other to develop these ideas?
That's the fun part.
Yeah, that's the fun part. I write to impress Larry. You know, I try to imagine him smiling, and I function very well in the student position. I love teaching, I love learning, and I love being I love both teaching and learning. So the fact that I started my career in a lot of ways under Larry's wing, in a sense, when we work together now, I am likely to work on the first draft more than he does, but I'm always very conscious of what is he thinking about this? How will he respond to this? I love having someone who I consider to be more advanced than I am, just, you know, further down that road of deeper skills, who's been working at it a longer time. It's a really precious thing. I have a great deal of gratitude to life that I still have Larry to play with.
Fantastic.
We're working to impress your collaborator, or startle him, or just show him something he hasn't seen, or make him laugh. I've always done that. Ever since I discovered collaboration with David Gerald, we've worked to impress each other, startle each other.
Love that. Cecil or Henry, have you worked with a collaborator before?
I mean, on comics, I do all the time, you know. So, I always think of a comic script as a love letter to the artist. The artist and the editor are my audience. They're the ones that I'm trying to impress, the artist most of all, because we're building that world together. I'm the Big Bang, and they're the dust that makes all the, you know, the planets and the stars and stuff. So yeah, absolutely, it's the joy of collaboration.
I'm quite certain I would be terrible to collaborate with. I'm very irritable when I don't get my way, so I would be horrible to collaborate with.
Yeah, there are great writers who shouldn't collaborate. Robert Heinlein was one of them.
Well, really, was Robert Heinlein known for being grumpy, or?
No, he just had a personal vision different from yours, different from everybody's. He could not have worked with anyone else's vision of how the universe worked. This is just my opinion, by the way. If Heinlein wrote a collaboration, I'd be amazed, but not shocked.
And Tananarive, you also have obviously been collaborating with Steven. Have you also collaborated with other writers as well, or what are your collaborative experiences?
He's the one. I can't think. Oh, well, I did collaborate with my late mother, Patricia Stevens Dew, on a civil rights memoir, which I really actually do consider my most important book, you know, because I was able to preserve those stories. But other than that, it's been Steve, always with family members. So I can do anything. I can collaborate with my mother and my husband. What? So, especially with scripts, that's where I'm most excited about collaboration, because I do tend to prefer to write prose alone, but Hollywood is all about collaboration, and with Steve, it's like he was saying with Larry, we try to surprise and delight each other. Sometimes we fall short. But it's so nice not to have to do all the heavy lifting, not to have to do all of the thinking, all the creating, all the imagining, and that I really do enjoy.
Fantastic. I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of sci-fi. So I'm wondering, with the age of the internet exploding over the past couple of decades, has that in any way influenced how authors make science part of sci-fi, in your opinion? So changes in technology and society and technology that's been happening so rapidly, how has that changed the landscape of bringing together science and sci-fi?
Yeah, I don't think you can separate. I mean, I'm inspired. Look, I've got my Scientific American right here. Like it's like I think Larry was saying this earlier. It's just like constantly like, getting the news to, everything that comes faster, CRISPR, whatever it is, sort of becomes the seeds of a million new stories. I love that. There's a really great organization called the Science Entertainment Exchange here in Hollywood, where they pair up scientists with sci-fi writers. So if you have a question about science, to make the science in your sci-fi more real, or if you want to get up to date, I had an AGI robot in a Batgirl issue, and so I spoke to a scientist about that. So I think that the accessibility of more information about real science is amazing in the world that we have now.
Fantastic. Who wants to jump in on that one?
It's really hard to try to just see even, I mean, who would have guessed in 2019 that 2020 would look like this? So it's very, very hard nobody. So it's very hard to see what is just around even the next corner. But I love research, and I think the world's a fascinating place if we decide it's going to be. So when I write science fiction, it's usually fiction about science, and it's some neglected cubby hole regarding science, not something that is trying to forecast into the future. So I kind of dance away from the very problem that the question is asking, but I'm exploring the things that are happening now that are not not likely to be swept away by the tide of history. I'm researching the way that dolphins email 3D holograms to each other, and so I consciously try to avoid the very problem that you're talking about, because I'm sure that I wouldn't do a very good job of it. I mean, somebody like Sarah Pinsker, who just won the Nebula for a song for a New Day, she did a phenomenal job of predicting 2020. I could not do that, so I'm going to go write about dolphin sonar instead.
Fantastic.
Most science fiction turns out to be engineering fiction, if you look at it hard. Most hard science fiction, that is.
Do you think it's changing or evolving in any ways, Larry?
Do I see what?
Do you think it's changing or evolving in any way?
Yes, happens all the time. Sure, we're concentrating more on other cultures, and their involvement in the future.
Interesting. CECIL, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to say, I hope it doesn't, it didn't come off that I'm like science, 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 and that's it, and we're predicting the future in any way. That's not what I'm saying at all. Like, I just think that the more, sort of access we have to different sources of inspiration and sources of reality. But I find it like really interesting that, there have been science experiments where you can give new technology to old people and they can kind of figure it out, but you give old technology to young people and they can't figure it out at all, and that's a science fiction unto itself as well. So kind of like what you're talking about, Henry, in terms of the, the three-dimensional dolphin, echo sonar that they do. That there are many different ways to engage with that science. I'm hearing strange things.
Yeah,
Corey, we need you to mute your mic.
Oh, hold on.
I got distracted.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead, CECIL.
But I think that there are lots of ways to play with the stuff that we have now that can either be predictive or explore the way that we engaged with that in a fantastical way.
I'm going to completely echo that. I mean, Cecil and I, we are both big fans of research. And one of the things, I also teach writing as well. One of the exercises that I give to my students is I make them write the most boring topic that they can think of. And then they have to randomly trade topics. And everybody gets 5 minutes to write the most interesting story about the most boring topic that they receive. And they struggle with it because everybody says taxes or insurance or waiting in line at the DMV or reading technical manuals. And I said, no. There's probably a world of interesting things about that very subject that you think is beneath your interest and attention and time. Here's the easiest way to find out about that world. Google weirdest stories about technical manuals or insurance disasters. You will find that there is a world of interesting stuff out there that would have been inaccessible to us before the internet. So if that is the question, I'm sorry, I misunderstood it. If that's the question, yeah, absolutely. The internet is a magical portal into worlds that we never thought were going to be worth our time.
Yeah, well, I think the question originally was just, yeah, go for it.
I was going to say, Henry, you were speaking and you said the most boring thing in the world. And then I was like, oh, what is that? And then I was like, oh, how can I make that interesting? And now I have an idea for a short story.
What was the most boring thing that you thought of?
Yeah.
I don't want to say.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
all
she's
right,
not
I'm
gonna
gonna
say it. So yeah, the question's about in this internet age, what's evolving for how we how the science and the sci-fi. Steven, do you want to jump in on that?
What's evolving in terms of the internet? The cathode ray tube has become the retina of the mind's eye. I'm sorry, I was having a video drum flashback. I think that all of our technology attempts to imitate something about what human beings are. You know, automobiles become legs, you know, telescopes become eyes, you know, telephones become voices. So what we have with the internet is, you know, up until at about 150 years ago, the human race finally got a central nervous system, as far as I'm concerned, the telegraph, instantaneous communication across lines, beyond lines of sight. So in some ways, with the internet and the telephone, so what the game now really begins, because the human race, you know, started in, you know, Olduvai Gorge area, spread around the world, developed it in various ways, and now then it came back together, and now one of the moments that in my life where I realized that I really did believe the human race was going to be fine was when I was doing field research in Tanzania, and I saw a Maasai tribesman guarding his flock, leaning on his spear, one-legged, talking into his cell phone. And you know what that said to me is that when we can all communicate with each other, when we can actually speak to each other, get to know each other, share ideas. It's a lot like what was it Sting that said, if the Russians love their children too, we're not going to have a problem. That what the internet gives us a chance to do is to find out that human beings are just human beings. All that knowledge is there, all that communication is there, and the same patterns are there in every culture, throughout every time, every race, creed, and color, every gender. It doesn't matter. We want the same basic things from the world, and that gives us communication between the different aspects of what it is to be human, and gives rise to what people used to call, you know, the Akashic record, the spiritual single repository of all human knowledge. I think that it's, you know, frickin' incredible and wonderful, and speaks very, very highly for the world that our grandchildren are going to have if we can manage this critical moment in time.
TANANARIVE?
I'll just jump on that. The connectivity aspect is pretty huge, and in ways that, as someone who doesn't write a lot of science fiction myself, it's even hard for me to imagine. But it's, yes, it's learning about people we didn't know about, intimacy that we're granted across the miles, you know, casual phone calls with people. He's in Australia, he's, you know, in Kenya. So that is world changing. And that's one of the most optimistic aspects of the internet, is that for all the toxicity that sometimes also bubbles up, we're all kind of holding hands in a way we never have. And that's having a profound impact on storytelling, just because our perspective of the world has broadened so much, and down to the trivial stuff. Like if Steve and I are watching TV and we're like, oh, I wonder what that actor did with the rest of his career. Oh, let me look it up. It's like, what did we do 30 years ago? And we wanted to know obsessive information about B actors in some random movie we were watching. We just have this expectation that we can know now. And that's very, very different than what has been in the past. And predicting new technologies is difficult. So when it comes to teaching students and research and that whole aspect, it's like, if you're writing something set 200 years in the future, honey, you need to sit down and do some serious thinking about how rapidly things are changing and what that means for your story that's set way beyond my imagination.
And I just want to, like, I remember in the past when we had phones and not the internet, and like all of my friends would call me up because I had everybody's phone number just in my head by heart. And it's sort of this skill set that was like very particular to a very particular part of time. And then, you know, that's gone. And it's the same thing with all of the technologies that keep changing. We have specialists that come in and sort of, you know, can know something very well, but then it sort of changes. And I find that kind of connectivity as well very fascinating. The way that we remember and forget in the world.
Fantastic. I want to go ahead and open it up for some of our audience questions. So, and just as a reminder to everybody, this event is to raise awareness for the Roswell Award and the Tomorrow Prize short sci-fi writing competition. So if you haven't made a donation yet, Corey's going to post the link for the GoFundMe in the chat, and we encourage you, even if it's $5, if you've enjoyed today's conversation, please help us out with a donation so we can keep short sci-fi writing alive. Okay, so the first audience question was actually emailed to me by somebody who registered in advance of the panel. And this person says, I love the mashup of genres. For example, blending crime noir with sci-fi elements. But it seems there's a thin line between a mashup working and being thought of as ridiculous. So any tips that you have for the best way to ride that, quote, razor's edge?
I'll jump in because I kind of already touched upon this. I think you have to decide what your tone is going to be. You know, how seriously are you going to treat this world? Is it going to be comic in tone, farcical in tone? Is it going to be something that's going to be lightly sketched in, like you know, like a Hitchhiker's Guide, where you're not really doing serious world building? Is this going to be Dune, or is this going to be Guardians of the Galaxy? Because those are actually both kind of mashups as well. And I think that you got to decide what the tone is going to be and the attendant amount of research. And I think that the research, as I was talking about before, will help you build the connective tissue between the genres, so that if you want to move away from a wacky, flippant tone, there is heft there, and you're treating this this hybrid genre you are writing with seriousness. I think the research is the answer. Again, I think you will find connections, family resemblances between these two genres. I mean, I think Ridley Scott's film Blade Runner is a great example of a mashup that took this very, very seriously. It was a private dick noir mashed onto well, we didn't have the word cyberpunk back then, but onto a cyberpunk world. It took that very seriously. And so that's a great example of somebody that went deep with it and created something that was a great success. So I think that you've got to decide your tone, and then if you're gonna treat this seriously, it's gonna take a lot of research to get it right.
Thank you. Those mashups. And TANANARIVE, I'd love to go to you because you've worked in horror so much and mystery. So when you're blending elements, how do you make that work?
I don't tend to think in terms of genre, although most of what I write is horror. So I'll just say that right up front. But I don't think of myself as trying to write a genre. I'm trying to write a story. And more specifically, I'm trying to write a character and a character's journey. And for me, that's always the answer. That's the answer for creating empathy. that's the answer for how do you blend genres, because if your reader is engaged with the protagonist they believe is 100% real and they're invested in that character's wants, needs, and obstacles, you've got them. It doesn't matter. You can, mash up whatever you want. If the character is real, the story is real.
Fantastic. Does anyone else want to contribute to that response? I wanted to ask Larry, one of the questions that came in is about research and how to keep it really applicable, fun, invoke the imagination. How have you worked with that research process in your writing?
When I'm working alone, I generally do the research and hope it generates a story. And I'm just looking for anything interesting in life and memorizing it if it comes around. When I worked with Jerry Pournelle, it was different. He actually went on research trips. We researched the burning city by driving north along what we call the hemp road in California. It was all written around Los Angeles, the burning city, 14,000 years ago when magic still worked. In the sequel, we traveled as far as the center of the United States, the Great Divide, stopping at various sites along the way. We worked in various clearly magical stuff, like the stone trees in the petrified forest.
So you literally went on a research journey.
Yes, we literally did that. And I felt like a real writer when that happened. I felt like a real writer on another occasion when Jerry and I were asked to work on a movie called The Walker in the Woods, The Watcher in the Woods. They'd made that movie and made changes in the original story until they had no ending. So that it looked like they'd fished an ending off the end of a Japanese monster flick. We sat in Jerry's hot tub with brandy snifters floating in front of us and speculated on how to fix the ending and came up with it that way. That is feeling really like a writer.
And that is how to make writing fun. Hot tubs and brandy.
Blog goals, collaboration goals.
Yeah, exactly. Anyone want to jump in? Steven, what are your thoughts on the research process and making that something that is really fun but also applicable and generating great things?
Part of fun is it's satisfying your needs, and everybody has different needs. So if there's a certain amount of work that needs to be done and I keep my mind on the project and wanting to do something that I think will be of value, and I'm always trying to do something I've never done before. It's one of the things that really turns me on in my work is I've never written anything like this before. So anything that I'm doing to support that is then part of the fun. And there is this thing that I call good, evil fun. When I'm working out in terms of like martial arts, something like this, a lot of it is not innately entertaining, or pleasant. But if you say, this is what I need to do in order to get to this position where I'm going to be able to do something I really care about, it's a little bit like shopping for your family. The shopping may, it's just a task in one sense, but then when you think about their smiles, you think about nourishing their bodies, and them saying, wow, that smells good or whatever, it takes on a luster. Okay. So, buying the books, doing the research, doing the reading, turning stuff over to your unconscious mind. But I can tell you that one of the things that I try to do is to research until I have an original thought, something I've never seen in any of the research that I'd be able to present to an expert in the field, and they would not look down their nose at me. When I was writing a novel set 30,000 years ago in East Africa called Great Sky Woman, I wanted to do research until I had an original thought on what is the dividing line between humanity and animals. Because there's a lot of talk about that. And so I researched and researched and researched until I had a notion that one way to define that line, something that all groups of human beings do, that no animals do, is they make and use fire as a tool. And that once I came up with that, the implications that came out of that in terms of hunting and protein availability and sharpening tools and turning three-dimensional objects into two-dimensional shadows, thereby opening the door to abstract thought and all sorts of interesting things. And I met, while I was on my 10-day or 2-week research tour in Tanzania, I met Dr. John Wagner, who was professor of anthropology at University of Kentucky. And when I mentioned my project to him, he volunteered to take a look at the early material and give me some thoughts. So very, very nervously, I put together my theory in several pages and sent it off to him. And then I just felt like such a fool. It's like, oh my God, all the pretender voices in my head were just going crazy. But then about 5 weeks later, I got a note from him saying, oh, Steve, I just returned from a conference in England and your subject was on the agenda. And, an academic paper was presented to that very end and so forth and so on. I said, yes, yes, I did it. I came up with something. So it's, research until you can ask an expert an intelligent question.
Yeah, and I think there's nothing more fun than talking to a scientist about the thing that they love, because they just will give you all of the little tiny pieces of information that not only are, if you've done your own work, like you can talk to them like Steven said, but also they can give you the little details about what the pipette feels like when it's doing this, or what it feels like to be on a dig, or like I went to Johnson Space Center for my book, and I got to talk with some astronauts about spacewalking and stuff, and it's the little things that sure they say in general, but then they're like, oh, and this, and that's where the good stuff is.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. Book research, internet research is great, but I was a journalist for 10 years, so I also love the interview, and having enough research to be on your feet to ask intelligent questions, and finding someone with a sense of humor, I think, is important as fiction writers. But when you can find that scientist or that expert in the field who will link with you, get that we're making this up, and have the flexibility to roll with that, unbelievable details, anecdotes, things that you would never find in a book. And that goes to writing from the character level, like right behind the character's eyes.
Fantastic. Henry, you want to say something?
I have nothing intelligent to add to that. That was great.
There's a question from Daniel that's specific for Larry Niven. Daniel says that Larry, your bio mentions a bookstore that facilitated a Caltech flunk out. What was the name of that bookstore?
I can't remember at all. I can't even begin to remember. I may never have memorized the name of the bookstore. I remembered how to walk to it.
Where was it?
It was in Pasadena, handy to Caltech.
Trying to think of what's near.
And I used to come home with a pile of books taller than my head. Old magazines. It was a total mistake, of course.
Well, riffing off of that, one of our audience members wanted to know, what is everyone reading right now? So, care to share?
I'm about to start reading Salman Rushdie's short stories. I don't know what the result will be.
I'm listening to the audiobook for Nisi Shaw's Everfair, and just finished The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones, which I'm
just starting The Only Good Indians, and I'm also reading up on a psychological discipline called Human Needs Technology.
I just started The Three Body Problem, but I can't remember what the name of the author is, but it's fantastic. Yeah, thank you. So I'm reading that.
It's so good. It is
I know.
so good.
I'm only on page 50,
It's
so
so
no spoilers.
inventive. No spoilers. And the whole trilogy is good. I mean, you saw that even President Obama was reading it.
Fantastic. And one more question just for Larry Niven. David wants to know, how did you end up writing the Star Trek animated series episode? Did they approach you or did you approach them? How did it come about?
Dorothy Fontana approached me, and I did several versions, well, several stories, in fact, always making veering from the obvious. One of my stories was too bloody. One of them involved quantum black holes, which are a little sophisticated for kids in that age, and maybe still. And eventually, Roddenberry himself suggested that I turn the soft weapon into the future weapon, into the slaver weapon.
Thank you. Patricia wants to know, do any of the panelists ever encounter people who look down their noses at science fiction and fantasy? And if no, great, but if yes, how do you respond?
Oh, heavens.
Not anymore.
That's what the block button is for.
Yeah, I was teaching at UCLA, and one of the other instructors came up to me and said, "Well, do you think you'll ever publish anything substantive?" And I said, "Do you think you'll ever publish anything at all?"
Burn.
Yeah,
I mean, here's what I'd love to throw back. You look at some of the great works of canonical literature, and they really are genre works. And you look at something like Kazuo Ishiguro, who won the Nobel Prize in 2017, one of the only good things to come out of 2017, in my opinion. But he is writing speculative fiction now. He is writing science fiction and fantasy, and there's no reason why genre is incompatible with intellectual depth or political relevance or any of those things. So I just actually enjoy it when people challenge me on this, because I love to talk. I love to teach a little bit. I love to defend it with great passion. I love the genre very much, and I enjoy taking them on.
Awesome. TANANARIVE, you were gonna. I'm gonna go to TANANARIVE. You were gonna say something. No problem.
I was just going to say, I feel like it's a little bit different now when you have everybody and their mother, watching, Westworld or, whatever. It's a little bit different than maybe say 20, 30 years ago when people were a little bit maybe more, had a more snobby opinion, just like with young adult fiction where, I had 8 novels out and I was at a literary party and someone asked me, much like Steven, when are you going to write a real book? And it's like, well, I wrote 8 real books. I'm sorry that you don't think they're real books, but I think that changes.
I remember what I was going to say now. Genre bias is getting better in MFA programs, not as bad as it once was, but I've heard faculty members make disparaging comments about genre in meetings, frankly, with the student body. And I definitely was pushed away from wanting to write genre when I was an undergraduate taking writing courses. I mean, nobody's in my face, but it's like, you get the idea of who's taken seriously and who isn't, and what constitutes real literature, what constitutes real writing. It is getting better, but I feel like there's probably still some work to be done to educate the educators.
I've always sort of felt that genre, before there was a solid young adult section in the bookstore, right? Kids would go from juvenile literature, when it was called juvenile literature, to genre, and then to like Kafka or whatever. And so I think that's why genre got sort of a bad rap for such a long time, is because it was considered a bridge to sort of the real stuff. And I think that's a shame. And I think that now that we have young adult as its own category, that starts to shift the blend. That's just my theory, but I'm going to stick by it.
But Kafka is totally genre.
I know. I just say Kafka because it's like
No, I get it. I get it.
thing I
But
aspired to when I was young. Like one day I'll read Kafka.
yeah, but that's what it would throw back at a litfic snob. So look, at Kafka is genre. It's slipstream. It's surrealist genre. But it is not realist fiction in by any measure.
All right, Dostoevsky. I'll use Dostoevsky next.
All right.
Okay, so last question, everybody, before we wrap up. And again, I just want to remind our audience, if you haven't donated yet to the sci-fi competitions GoFundMe, help us out so we can open up for submissions September 15th. So for the last question, I'm actually going to bring together two questions. So one of them asks, what's the opportunity moving ahead for sci-fi? What topics haven't been covered enough yet? And the other one is, how optimistic are you feeling right now with so many people talking about impending doom in the world? So bringing those two together, topics that you think haven't been covered enough yet, what's in it for the future, and are you feeling optimistic?
I like feeling optimistic. I like putting optimism in my stories because I can reach further that way. I don't picture humanity curling up in a little ball to die. I admit things are bad around us right now. I wasn't expecting a plague, but we'll be over that.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing going on that we haven't gone through before. I mean, in a lot of ways, I almost feel sorry for people who thought that things were better than they were, because I've been trying to tell people how bad things were in certain ways for a long time. But even during those periods of time, I never lost my optimism. I've never stopped believing in humanity and the human race. And I've never thought that we were going through anything that our species hasn't gone through, and worse, in the past. There's always been death. There's always been plague. There've always been tyrants. There's always been that stuff. And since 1 second after the Big Bang, the universe has been a continual story of increasing interconnection and complexity. Now we're seeing that happening on the human level, and there are people whose egos are having a hard time surrendering to the fact that the world is changing around them. It's future shock up the wazoo. And, absent an absolute disaster, we'll be fine. And the people who make the difference will be the people who've been optimistic all this time, the people who keep fighting, the people who believe in something. So I'm going to be one of those. If the universe says, game over, the universe says game over, but I'm not going to beat myself.
Yeah, there's definitely a mind-body connection. So optimism is good for your health, first of all. But it's a painful time for a lot of people. There's a lot of uncertainty. There is a lot of loss. There's nothing we can do to protect ourselves from loss and grief. This is just part of the human passage. But overall, yes, I do believe in optimism, and optimism is kind of the armor that I wear to try to get through the moments that are harder, to realize that they typically don't last, that things are cyclic, and ultimately, most people, I truly do believe, are good. So counting on that. But yeah, it's not anyone's imagination that these times feel different. I've never felt anything like this in my life. And I think that on the other side of that, which is, oh my God, we're all gonna die. On the other side is, what a time to be alive, which I also feel as deeply because of the changes I'm seeing, the embrace of marginalized voices and all the shifts we've been talking about. It's just like, wow, I can't believe I lived to see this. So both of those things are true. Terrible times, wonderful times. And optimism is what helps get us through.
Yeah, I'm excited. I mean, as a person who just loves stories so much, I'm so excited for more stories at the table. And so I think that's something that that is just as a greedy story person, that's really exciting. All the voices that are coming in. And also I'm really interested in, how do we sort of imagine more beautiful world, just springboarding off of the optimism that Steven and TANANARIVE are talking about is, how do we imagine we know things are a little bit messed up moving forward. We know that we're going to be encountering some problems. So how do we imagine that in a better way? And I think as science fiction writers, we are kind of primed to sort of begin to come up with ways to see, because you can't have hope for things that you can't think of. I'm saying it wrong, but you can't imagine what's not there. And so it's up to us to kind of begin to imagine the hopeful things that can come from what is coming down the pike.
In addition to all those profound answers, one of the things that to get back to the first part of the question, the things that I would like to see more of, that I think we're starting to see, that is one of the things that gives me optimism about this time, is different types of stories, different story forms drawn from different sources and inspirations. And when we talk about, there's a lot of talk about diversity and representation in the world today. And usually when we talk about diversity, we're talking about the identities of the creators of the art and the characters. So we're talking about faces, we're talking about people and their identities. And as important as that is, I'm also really excited about diverse story forms, learning from different cultures that tell stories in very different ways. And so I teach the East Asian 4-act structure, which is a radically different structure. And I'm shocked to see it gaining a foothold in America. Parasite, if you have not seen Parasite, first foreign language film to ever win the Best Picture Oscar. And it's phenomenal. It is a masterpiece. That is not told in a traditional Western 3 or 5-act structure. It's told in a 4-act structure, mostly known by the Japanese name of Kisho Tenketsu, which is a radically different structure. But you don't even, audiences in the US don't even realize this is happening. It's all happening under the hood. All they know is that they are sucked in by this story. And that gives me a lot of hope that we can actually not just have diverse creators, not just have diverse characters, but actually be learning diverse ways to tell stories. There is not just one story to be told. Beauty comes in all shapes and sizes. So that is something I would like to see more of, and that is also something that makes me optimistic about this year in particular. As bad as this year has been, there have been some beautiful things to come out of this year.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, I think that's a great note to wrap up our panel on. And Larry, TANANARIVE, Steven, Henry, CECIL, thank you so much for being a part of this panel today, for giving your time for this phenomenal discussion. I appreciate each of your thoughts and ideas. And I know our audience has been saying so too. They've just been so impressed and feeling lucky to be able to join you this evening. So once again, thank you. And for everyone who is interested in submitting a story to the Roswell Award, which is open to writers 16 and over around the entire world, or for the Tomorrow Prize, which is for high school students in LA County. COREY ROSKIN has been posting the links, but you can go to the lightbringerproject.org website, and you can also get information on our GoFundMe site. So don't forget to donate. And everyone, please have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.